Welcome. I'm Dr. Rana. I'm a clinical psychologist in Ottawa, Canada. I was really excited to see when I was looking at the registration, the different folks seem to be from different places, but it's not always clear where your city is. So if you could let me know in the chat, actually, sort of where you are, it's always nice to see where people are joining us from. If you're anywhere near where I am in Ottawa, I hope that you're doing okay with all the snow. So I work in private practice, and the way that I describe the work that I do is that I work with relationships in transition. And so that often means that can mean so many different things. Sometimes it's about working with new parents and working with that peripartum period. Sometimes it's working with adults and their parents or parents of adult children. It's working with folks who are navigating divorce and separation. It's navigating folks who are dating and looking and exploring their different relationships. And so it is really important for us to learn different ways to manage them. And instead of niching myself into one little topic, I've decided to work with relationships in transition. And today, offering you a description, a way to think about the relationship between a parent and their adult child. I'm always curious to know how this relationship shows up in the work that you do. So feel free to let me know in the chat, in what stage of this relationship do you see it? Do you see it in peripartum? Do you see it as parents are navigating divorce and separation and they have to work with the in-laws, or at any other point, right? Around a wedding, around a funeral, so many different times where that can show up. So we're talking about that relationship. What does it mean when it shows up in our therapeutic room? How can we navigate some of those most extremes around estrangement, and a little introduction to strategies in terms of the work that you could do with your clients. And so parenting issues in a parent-child relationship doesn't just show up when someone comes in and asks for help with parenting. I think we see that a lot for those of you who might be working with parents of younger children. They seem much more comfortable coming in and helping them navigate the toddler years or tantrums or even adolescence. But when it comes to adult children, it often comes up almost as a secondary issue for many different reasons. I think that more and more we're asking about it. But there'll be maybe a major life transition. Child is getting married, for instance, or a crisis, illness, or conflict, including estrangement. And it sort of shows up in therapy like, oh, by the way, or, I was here to talk to you about depression, and now there's a bit of a side quest, and we're going to talk about my relationship with my adult child. And the sort of nonchalance almost that sometimes it shows up with can be surprising. Some of the examples that have shown up in my therapy room, and these are not the real names, and I sort of mixed in a couple of cases in there to protect confidentiality, are some of these. So for instance, Jessica, mother of 3, is struggling because her oldest child is getting ready to go to university, but she feels that he's not ready because he's struggling in so many areas of his life. So she actually is wondering whether she should let him do that or how she should support him if he does decide to do that. Another case is another client whose stepdaughter is getting married and has asked him, the stepdad, to walk her down the aisle instead of her biological dad. And that being a tension or point of conflict that would need to be addressed or that the client was concerned about and wanted to discuss. Another client will come in terms, first asking about anxiety, but then they will bring in another issue, like talking about their adult son and how he's, decided to cut ties with the family and describe their relationship as being toxic. How does she navigate that? Working with a grandparent who is having difficulty adjusting to their role as a grandparent now and being really upset by some of the limits that have been placed on visiting her daughter and grandchildren. Working with a client, perhaps you were working on something like anger management, and after some time they talk to you about their adult son who's been fired and needs their financial support again, or they're concerned that this son has failed to launch. That can show up in therapy too, right? Or a longtime client who has been diagnosed with a terminal illness and now want your support as to how to determine and make some important decision, like who is going to be the power of attorney, right? There are all different ways that it could show up. And I'd be curious to know if this resonates with any way in which you have seen the parent and adult child relationship in your therapeutic work, or if there's an example that stands out to you. If you could share that with us in the chat in a anonymous way, of course, without identifying clients, that would also be great. I'm always curious to know what shows up. So why is parenting continuing to be a challenge sometimes when the children are no longer kids? Well, parenting is a part of our identity. It's measured as a way that we have committed to our children, what we've given up to our kids, even in the way that we've chosen to raise them and the decisions that we made along the way, right? And so it becomes very personal because very often parents will see their children as being an extension of themselves. Right? And that the parenting style that they chose and the decisions that they made came with maybe what they don't realize as being expectations now that their children are adults. And becoming a parent involves so many changes in our identity, in our relationships, in our priorities, the way that we spend our time. Of course, it had changes on our body and the way that we think, right? And this continuously changes over time. If there's one thing that you can't become when you're a parent, it is complacent, because your child is always going to be changing. And parents sometimes judge their success, or perhaps feel judged by others, by the way that their children have turned out. And so there might be stigma or shame if they have a child who has failed to launch, or a child who is no longer in contact with them. They might feel that it's their fault, or other people might think that it's their fault. There might be some societal, cultural shame around it. They might blame themselves because they can't just take credit for the good stuff. And even the good stuff sometimes can be negative, because then a child might say, oh, well, I've overachieved because I was, raised to please you, right? So they might feel like they were damned if they do and damned if they don't. And so parenting does change over time. And we can think of the parenting task as in terms of the child's developmental stages, or as the task that the parent, has growing up. As the child is growing up. So the child's developmental needs, infancy, toddler years, school age, teenager, an emerging adult, adulthood, middle age, the child themselves becoming a parent, those are all developmental stages in the child. And at each of these, the parent's task changes from caretaking to education to coaching, mentorship, and then maybe a return to dependence if the child moves back home, right? And so that's going to change over time. And at each stage, especially when the child is an adult, the role is adapting and earned as well. That the relationship that a parent is going to have with their adult child is to a certain extent earned. It is one that has been fostered and developed, right, over time. And so all of this, whether we are thinking about it as a child's developmental stages or as parental tasks, is a series of transitions that they have to go through over and over again. One of the sort of oldest models of parenting and the stages of parenting are Ellen Galinsky's stages. And she describes 6 developmental stages that parents go through as their children grow up. And each stage focuses on how the parents change and adapt their roles and their skills in response to the child's environment. So even before baby is born, prospective parents imagine what it's like to be a parent, how their lives are going to change, what their baby is going to be like, what being in a family like that is going to be like, what they want to be like as a parent and what they're not, right? And through that, there's several events that they might experience that is going to have an impact later on. For instance, if there's challenges with fertility, if there's difficulties in the co-parenting relationship, even just the decision of becoming pregnant or not, or finding alternative pathways, all these different experiences impact a parent's identity in this image-making stage. When baby arrives as an infant, parents develop this attachment bond, or the baby develops an attachment bond with the parent, and the parent has to adapt to caring for an infant. They have to reconcile their expectations of what it was going to be a parent. No matter how much you prepare, you're never actually ready, right? And here we often talk about this period of matrescence, the change in identity, body, self-perception, and relationships that occur when we become a parent. Galinsky spoke of an authority stage when the baby is a toddler or preschool, when the parents establish rules, decide the extent of how much authority they're going to have on their child and how much autonomy they're going to allow their child to have. The child's personality is coming through. They start saying no and want to do things themselves, even though they don't know how to do it. And every decision for parents at this stage feels really, really big because they've had such a short amount of time with this child. There's often this concern that, anytime they raise their voice, they've damaged their child or their relationship, for instance, right? We get a lot of anxious parents at this stage who want to do the right thing. As the child grows up a little bit and they're in their middle childhood, the parents sort of help their child navigate some social experiences outside of the family as they start to make friendships, and they provide explanations and teach lessons, of course, based on their own history, based on their own experiences, values, right? And this is where values of fairness, respect, connection are sort of put into practice outside of the family unit. And here parents frequently have an experience of feeling rejected because they're not needed in the same way, and a parent might respond very differently to that stage. And there's a lot more people in the child's life at that point because they have friends and whatnot. In adolescence, parents really have to renegotiate their relationship with the teenager, because finding the right balance of decision-making and sharing the decision-making power while also maintaining appropriate limits, keeping the child safe. I often talk about adolescence as being a period of actually return to toddlerhood, where there's this unearned confidence of what you can do or what you should be able to be allowed to do, but actually not having the knowledge or skill to do it, right? So there's this huge interdependence that is still present, but this need to differentiate from the adolescent as well. And sometimes the parents might feel shocked by some of their child behaviors or be worried about the dangers that they could face, or maybe because they've lost some of the influence they had in this relationship. And so it's important for parents at this stage to know their priorities, their values, their boundaries, and update the view that they have of their child. Accept that their child is growing up, develop these new communication skills, how they're going to do that. And then in early adulthood, parents begin to reflect on their success or what they see as failures or successes as their children become more independent and are at least expected to leave the home. It's a period of evaluation, of reflection for parents. And when it doesn't happen, there can be some shame and embarrassment or that the parents experience. And so they might begin to form ideas of what their own future is going to look like and what role they are going to play moving forward in the life of their child. They have to continue to adapt to the needs of their child. There might be long periods where the parent and the child are separated, right? If the child leaves for studies, or if they get married, if they change jobs, if they travel, and they really sort of lose sight sometimes of where their child is in a way that is new for them. And so parents might really begin to search for ways to still call themselves a family, but adapt to the new roles, to the new rituals. They have to integrate new people in their lives if there's partners or children. And also they have to say goodbye to people sometimes if there's a partner that the relationship doesn't work out, right? And there's still that continuous adaptation that happens. And they might want to cling on to some things that are really important to them, especially if their child hasn't made the choices that they expected them to. And they might have difficult questions for themselves about how much and how to be available, how to provide help without being controlling, accepting a child as separate. And, you know, when you've seen someone be so teeny tiny and they used to look up to you and now they're this completely different person, it can be hard for parents. And I think there's room for some compassion in that difficulty of shifting in that role, learning to accept the child's separateness. And on top of that, all of the generational and cultural changes, right? Now, one thing that I find is, this is a nice map, but Galinsky's model doesn't talk about how this model is about almost 30 years old now. And I don't think it necessarily captures how parents today have much more choices about how they are going to raise a family, about how they are going to include and who they are going to include in their lives, about how they're going to raise their kids. And this is true for the parents of adult children, but also the adult children. And there is such a cultural shift in the makeup of the family, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that isn't necessarily reflected in this model. And I think that it's part of what makes the relationship between parents and adult children so complex today. And so, of course, it's not a surprise to you that the parent-child relationship doesn't occur in isolation. There are parenting factors that play a role: the parent's personal history, their personality, their mental health, their life choices, and anything from education to age or health needs. There's the child's own personality, their own life experiences, their own wishes, their own health. And there's also the social cultural characteristics, right? The culture, religious upbringing, social support that influence parenting and the parent-child relationship, regardless of the child's age. And as the child grows older, the impact of those environmental factors might be different. Parents may continue to live by a certain set of cultural norms and rules and expectations, and children, having experienced the world in a whole new way, or in a different way, in a different time, have much different experiences and expectations than their parents. And so modern family dynamics are impacted by this, of course. And I think the most salient factor is that the family model is much more disconnected from traditions and institutions that used to dictate relationships and roles within a family, right? Whether these are cultural or religious norms, the expectations and options for what you can do with yourself and for yourself is really different. And I believe that to be a good thing, but change is difficult, right? And so that has created a culture that is much more individualistic and also egalitarian, where the focus of happiness comes much more from your individual achievements and wellness rather than that of your community. And within the family, this egalitarian model means that it is no longer the parents who are setting the benchmark of appropriate or acceptable behavior. Rather, it is a child-centered, child-focused family dynamic and family structure that ultimately decreases the authority of the parent. Again, this isn't neither good or bad. It simply is sorry, I got distracted. Somebody popped in. This isn't neither good or bad. It is simply a description of what the relationships are like right now. Mm-hmm. So in this child-focused parenting model or family structure, it's no longer the child who has to earn the parent's love and show respect. Now it's the parent who has to earn the love and respect of their child. And one of the questions that comes into my office, I want to say every single time I work with parents of young children, is I want to make sure that it's a version of, I want to make sure that they still want me around when they're an adult. I don't want them to feel about me the way that I feel about another parent. And there's such a self-imposed pressure almost to undo something that they've experienced as harmful. And within this new structure, children get to choose their relationships, including with their parents, and living within a culture. And I've spoken about self-focused wellness trends in different workshops, but this idea that other people shouldn't stop your happiness. This me first, I'm going to prioritize my own peace. And so if my parents are not part of my peace, I don't need to have that relationship, right? So that's going to impact the type of information that is shared, how involved parents are going to be allowed to be. On the one hand, we see so much enmeshment, where there's this trend of young adults who are going to college and parents are showing up to live either on residence or to live 2 blocks down. Parents are helping with college applications, with moving in, and even are much more open to their adult children coming back home after finishing a degree, right? Sometimes it's necessary for financial reasons. Sometimes it's healthy and negotiated. Other times it's enmeshments. And a part of me, we can't blame parents. They're used to being on their phone and connected with their kids all the time. They want to know more. But that also means that they worry more and that they're going to react when things change. What do you mean you left the whole weekend? You didn't tell me about it. Oh, you picked an apartment without involving me? Like, that can feel really hurtful. Again, it's neither right or wrong. It's just the experience of the parent. At the same time, the demands of adulthood have changed. Now there's a stage of emerging adulthood. that has sort of pushed back a little bit. Being an adult today is really different from what it was from previous generations. Folks have to study longer to get a job. They wait longer before having children, if they choose to have children at all. They change careers much more often than was common in previous generations. And so this generation may seem more delayed in terms of education, finding a partner, having children, these tasks that in the West we associate with adulthood, right? But at the same time, there's so much instability, such a rapid pace of change in the workforce and the economy that they don't have a choice but to stay in school for longer, right? Adulthood is now a little bit longer and much more vulnerable than it was previously. And there can be very much these clashes between generations and cultures. Parents who bring expectations from their cultures, if for first generation immigrants, children who grew up in Canada, I say Canada, I mean Canada, who grew up one place with parents who did not. There might be clashing expectations and torn loyalties of how much they owe their parents. And that can lead to confusion and shame for both the adult child and the parent, right? And because parents might have a completely different point of reference for completely different expectations of what an adult child should do, right? And in all of that, the role of the parent changes. They become a safety net that is has to negotiate its space, whether it's emotional support or instrumental support, right? And much more in terms of a mentor or coach. Okay. So it is a very different role and sometimes in very different contexts. So what creates tension? And here I'd love to know if these topics that I brought forward are similar to the ones that you see in your work. You can let me know in the chat. And if there's one topic that comes up a lot that I haven't mentioned, please let me know as well. I'm always curious to know more about what you see in your clinical work. So often disagreement over life choices. And this could be anywhere from what they're going to study, career paths, a lifestyle where they choose to travel instead of having a steady job, for instance, a choice of partner, right? So that can, or even parenting approaches, if the adult child is a parent. So that can lead to disappointment, judgment, frustration, misunderstanding on both sides. Right? Some research tells us that parents list their adult children as one of their closest confidants. And as the adult child grows up, they might push back against that role. And that shifting of expectations and needs can certainly cause some tension as well. And in that, adult children may reevaluate their upbringing. They have a new perspective, sometimes confronting their parents about past behaviors that they view as harmful. And in response to that, parents feel unfairly judged or misunderstood. If parents don't have the reflective functioning skills, the empathy, the capacity to be open-minded, then they can really struggle to maintain a healthy relationship and communication. And so these old wounds, these unresolved issues resurface, right? And the parents might feel blamed. Parents might feel that they have to cope with an adult child's problems, right? So issues like an adult child who has financial difficulties, health problems, mental health problems can increase stress for parents who maybe expected that they would have a very different retirement, for instance. Shifting roles also includes coping with aging of the parent. When older parents have age-related functional limitations, adult children might feel a need or begin to monitor them more, or maybe even control some of the parents' behaviors and the parents feel defensive about that, right? And they might withhold information so that their child doesn't take care of them in a different way, right? And so that creates this sort of push and pull and maybe even resentment because the child might feel that the parent is unnecessarily holding information against them, but the parent doesn't want to impact the child's life negatively, and also they want to protect their own autonomy. And I hope here, as I'm talking about this, that you hear some generous interpretations of people's actions and why they react the way that they do. And as we've discussed before, the cultural and generational value shifts that happen, right? And that can be especially in terms of reciprocity and expectations of support. There might be mismatched expectations regarding financial, emotional, practical support that parents expected and that adult children feel as being a burden. Right? And abuse of parent by an adult child. If there's been a history of family violence and abuse, the child might take a very different path in terms of their relationship. So what becomes our therapeutic tasks when this walks? And I see that some folks are sharing their experiences. Thank you so much. I'm going to read them in detail and respond to you after the fact, but others, I invite you to take a look at those. So what becomes our therapeutic tasks and our challenges? When this parent and adult child relationship surfaces, it's really important, if we haven't already, to take that detailed history, go back to that genogram, go back to that timeline of that parent's life to see what it was like for them to become a parent, to raise this child. What were the significant life events and their expectations at different points? This can be true for the child and for the parent. If you can, get multiple perspectives, talk to a sibling, talk to a partner, right? Who can maybe give you a different insight onto what life was like growing up. That information can be really valuable. Of course, there's always room for some well-timed psychoeducation. So, and ways that you can support intergenerational relationships, about cultural considerations, about parenting structure and the change in parenting and family structure, about the developmental needs of children. Yeah. I've seen the question. I will come back to it at the end. Okay, so I can go in there to make sure. And our work becomes expanding our client's perspective in terms of the experience that they're having. So helping them develop that cognitive flexibility, challenging some unhelpful or outdated beliefs that they have. Okay. Sometimes it's skill-based, communication skills, conflict resolution, ways for a parent to communicate with their child or the child to communicate with their parent. Right? And explore different actions that could help repair the relationship. Taking responsibility, adapting expectations, setting boundaries appropriately and maintaining them. Sometimes it involves writing an apology letter or simply some listening skills and tolerance, right? And for the therapist, it's really important in here to not fall trapped to a blame game, to taking sides or even pushing a solution. Our own beliefs about family, about what the parent and adult-child relationship should look like, our own experiences are going to show up. And so when you're working with someone who is not in the room, it's really important to focus your attention, recognize your own reaction, but focus the work on what this particular person is grieving and where they want to go with this particular relationship. And here, thinking about how the needs of a parent and adult-child relationship has changed. And I always go back to sort of three main pillars. First is to working on describing what is happening instead of labeling it. There are a lot of words being thrown around: emotionally immature parent, toxic relationship, narcissistic mother. Those labels maybe feel empowering and maybe give a sense of clarity, but really what they do is pigeonhole. If we can encourage our clients to describe what is happening for them, what could be happening in the other person. So describing the behavior and their internal world, not only does that slow down the narrative, but it also moves it beyond this superficial catch-all label and requires the person to actually take some accountability for what they're alleging has happened, right? The second pillar is that of responsibility. And here, I stand by the fact that it is always the adult's responsibility, the adult meaning the parent, excuse me. I stand by the fact that it's always the parent's responsibility to be open and available for repair and offer emotional safety. Even if your child is an adult, they are still your child. There is always a child in the room and you will always be a parent. And that yearning doesn't go away with age. And so the parents to be able to take that responsibility that they will always have some power over their child, right? Even if it doesn't feel that way to them. But with an adult child, there is also the responsibility of the adult child to be curious, as I'll come to, but also recognize their parents' capacity. To recognize that there's going to be things that your parent is not going to be able to offer you, and recognizing that rupture, recognizing that pain, something that needs to be grieved, and recognizing, accepting what your parent can offer, then allows you to make a choice as to where you want to go with this relationship. But it is your responsibility to take a look at what can actually happen in this relationship, what is actually really realistic. And finally, curiosity about yourself, your own reaction. Why does this matter to me? Why do I get so upset when my mom gives my toddler ice cream and I told her not to, right? What is this actually about? But also curiosity about the other person. What could be motivating their actions? And of course, to a certain extent, if the other person is not in the room, we're making guesses. But at the very least, we're practicing that reflective functioning. We're practicing that cognitive flexibility. And when we're curious, it's also curious about, okay, well, what can we do about this? What is actually realistic? Next, in terms of navigating family estrangement and reconnection. And here I feel like we could, I could be giving a full talk just about this. And I do talk about it a lot more in the longer training, but it is such a hot topic right now that it's important to bring it to the surface. Here, I'm talking mostly about working with parents because, at least in my clinical experience, when the adult child has made the decision to cut off a relationship, whether it's temporary or not, they have made that decision before coming into my office. And while we can work towards reconciliation with them, they are not necessarily dealing with the fallout at that point. But if you are working with a parent or family member who has to deal with estrangement, some of the ways that we can support them in navigating this is by helping them develop the skills of being validating and non-judgmental or open as to what could be happening for their child instead of being defensive. And of course, they're going to bring that defensiveness, that hurt and anger into your office, but then it becomes our job to make space for that and also make space for them validating their child and being open to listening to their child's point of view without getting defensive. Helping them accept aspects of their adult child's life that they haven't necessarily been able to face, that this child is now independent, and self-reflect on what they can do in this situation, or perhaps what they have done. We've talked already about the therapeutic task, so I'll move forward. And about some approaches and strategies that can be used to work with parents and their adult children. I always end up coming back to acceptance, forgiveness, and compassion. Parents and adult children often clash over major life decisions, career paths, lifestyles, parenting approaches, roles in the family. And here, I think it's a good time to answer one of the questions in the chat that I saw. So I have noticed that many cultures support parents' involvement in couples' relationships. Can you share something on that? Well, many cultures do support it, and many cultures don't. And when both people in that couple agree as to what the role of the extended family should be, there is likely to be less conflict than when there isn't agreement on that. When there is a clash of cultures and one person in the couple expects their mother to be able to give their commentary on things, and the other person in the couple does not. And that becomes first a discussion between those in the couple. What is going to be acceptable for us? What are we comfortable with? What are we not comfortable with? What did we think we were going to be comfortable with? And it turns out we're not, right? So that couple, having created a new unit, has to negotiate what is going to be acceptable for them and how much involvement they're going to allow to have. I hope that answers that a little bit. So when we're working with either the adult child or the parent and developing this self-reflection, what people are calling, at least partly, this emotional maturity, it means being able to name and tolerate the differences, right? And if there's always been conflict in this relationship, it's not going to just disappear because all of a sudden there's a baby around or all of a sudden there's a wedding to be planned, right? And remembering that the parent always has some emotional power in this relationship because they are the parent. If they don't agree with the child's life choices, then it is the work for them to accept this independence and find a way, a joy in connecting with their child that is still meaningful to them. For the parents to be able to reflect on perhaps ways that they might have fallen short, accept who their child is and what choices they've made. Accept that their child is going to make a lot of choices that actually has nothing to do with them. Sometimes parents amplify the role that they have. I didn't raise my child to be this way. Yeah, maybe you didn't. And then they met people or they had life experiences that taught them otherwise, right? And sort of helping them zoom out a little bit in terms of the influence that they have now. Sometimes this type of work, this emotional maturity work, what it is at its root is simply naming emotions and labeling them. I find myself doing that with parents of adult children so much. To a certain extent, it has to do with the skills that they learned growing up or that they were allowed to do. If they weren't allowed to talk about emotions, well, they don't really know how to do it as an adult now, right? Sometimes it feels juvenile to do that with, an adult but it's part of the work, right? Developing some of those communication skills, developing some of those listening skills with them, and helping them practice curiosity about their child's life. Right? And what I have found to be a really helpful tool is this contact and closeness spectrum. So there should be a worksheet in your book where what I have found is that a lot of models talk about contact, which is how often, for how long two people will be in touch with each other. So face-to-face video, 30 seconds at a time, 6 hours all day versus 3 times a year, right? And other models talk about closeness, that intimacy in the relationship, what you talk about, how you talk about it, how vulnerable you are with the other person, right? The range of affect that is displayed in that relationship. But I haven't seen any models that actually put them together. And so what I use with clients is this contact and closeness spectrum that helps clients not only describe where they are in a relationship, but it also helps them understand how they got there and where they would like to be. Right? And so using this visual representation, breaking it down into the different components of what does low contact versus high contact look like? What does high closeness versus low closeness look like? How come you ended up where you did? Where would you like to go? Where do you think that you would be comfortable in this relationship? And really, as long as you are making an intentional choice in the relationship, you can choose to be wherever you want, right? So in this diagram, as you talk to your clients and talk about the low contact, we are in touch twice a year. We see each other at Christmas and Easter. Anywhere in between, we chat once a week, and I might text them a couple of times in between, versus I see them every week. I text them all day. There's not a single day I go without talking to my mom, right? Anywhere in between. And then closeness. I share everything. I don't make a single decision in my life without talking to my parent. Oh yeah, how come? What would happen if you did it, right? Versus they know nothing about my life. They know nothing about my life because they don't know where I live, or they know nothing about my life because I just talk about the superficial stuff, right? You've made a choice there. So in that high contact, high closeness, there could be the stage of enmeshment, where there's role reversals or breach boundaries. The identities are unclear, who ends where. Sometimes we're in contact a lot, but it's superficial. We don't talk about the deep things. We just do it. I just provide the support for them. I help them with the groceries, right? But they don't really know what's happening inside. It's very controlled. And that's okay. Sometimes we're very close, but we're not able to have a lot of contact. Maybe sometimes that has to do with as simple as the child works shift work. And so it's really difficult for them to find a time to connect with their parent. We don't have a lot of contact, but when we do, we're close. We pick up where we left off. Or they live abroad, or maybe they have a job that they travel for a lot, right? So it's either negotiated because they know that this is how it's going to work, or it has to do with the functions of life. And sometimes it is very selective, where we don't have contact often for a long period of time. And when we do, we don't talk about much. Or we don't have any contact and we don't see each other at all, and they have no idea what's going on in my life. And, I place balance is secure in the center, but really it is where your client can be and feel regulated and feel as fulfilled as possible. which is why I talk about a healthy enough relationship. We talk about good enough when talking about good enough parenting when the kids are little, but when we work towards healthy enough, it's a relationship that is intentional and that feels safe. Before opening it up to questions, I wanted to let you know about two trainings that are coming up. I assume that after the webinar, you'll walk away, or at least I hope that after the webinar, you'll walk away with new insights and information about the parent and adult-child relationship. But as most of you know, the challenge in our work is to apply it and to put it into practice with the folks who are sitting in our office. And so in February, on February 24th, I'm offering a 3-hour training. It's a live training of working towards healthy enough, where I go deeper into understanding the changing roles and needs of this dyad. I help develop or give you tools to develop a case conceptualization and clear targets for treatment. We work on more concrete strategies to work with things like overcorrection, rigid patterns, and intergenerational conflict. And we talk about applying the closeness and contact spectrum practically. So some exercises and questions that help work through it. So registration for that is open, and there is an early bird pricing if you register before February 5th. And the second is if you are looking for support in other ways in consultation group, that starts in February. You can use the code there to find more information about each of those. Opening it up to questions. Has this reflected what shows up in your therapy work? Is there something you see that really isn't reflected? Any questions? Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any resources to recommend to work with parents so they can foster a relationship to make their adult child feel safe when there has been a lot of trauma?
Trauma caused by the parent?
Trauma caused, in situation, for example, of parental alienation, when a child has been alienated from a parent or both due to the high conflict divorce, and how to reconnect and build that sense of safety.
Yes, I can think of a few resources. And here I'm assuming that you're talking about resources sort of for the parent?
Yes, for the parent to work with the child.
Yes. So not for the parent, but not for the child. So you know what? Send me an email and I can think of a couple of books and even podcast episodes that might fit what you're talking about. Yeah. Off the top of my head, it's kind of hard to oh, that's the title of the book. I don't want to butcher it. But yes, I can think about it because I think you're pointing to something really important. Sometimes we underestimate. A lot of the work I do is with high conflict separation and divorces. I do the parenting assessment for family court. And we underestimate the impact of even inadvertent parental alienation, of how much children are sponges when it comes to internalizing the attitude that one parent has about the other parent. We do underestimate that. And sometimes we don't see the impact until years later. So yes. Thank you. Oh, I'm seeing a couple things in the chat. Let me see if there's questions there. Yes, I could send the books and podcasts to everyone for sure. I'll send it with the recordings. Okay, I'm just reading a question here. In my work, I've been seeing adult children who have presented as parentified children. They are having a hard time moving forward into their own retirement now. Their parents are elderly and require assistance, but are from being demanding with their request. So I'm assuming the adult child feels that their parent is being demanding. Tools can be helpful for those adult children. Yeah. So what tools, when a child feels that their adult parent is being demanding, there's a couple of things that I would want to explore. First is the discomfort of seeing a parent age. And, regardless of the conflict, even when a child says, I hate my mom, hate isn't the opposite of love, right? So there are feelings there. And so I wonder if part of that might be the grief and the discomfort of seeing a parent age. So that's one thing maybe to explore with this particular client or with these clients. The other part around that is for them to recognize what is going to be sustainable for me to offer. What is going to be sustainable in terms of instrumental support, amount of money, amount of time I'm going to spend with this parent. And being able to make that concrete and practice that with their parent. And then that becomes that practice of saying no to the parent and maybe helping to fill in that gap. Maybe that means helping with finding a PSW or helping them find a lifestyle or a place to live that is going to be sustainable. So there's that self-boundary piece in practice. There's that very concrete part of, okay, if I'm going to withdraw some of my support because I need to take care of myself, what am I going to offer? Or how can I mend that gap? And then I think the most important part is that bit around the grief of seeing a parent age. So I hope that gives you a couple of places to explore with these clients, Ashley. Aren't any other questions? thank you for spending your lunch hour, or actually that's not true, someone's in BC, breakfast maybe with us, with me today. I will be following up with an email before the end of the week with the recording and the resources I just talked about. Feel free to reach out to me if you've got any questions, if you're looking for consultation or are interested in the longer training, and find me on social media. I'm always happy to connect. Thank you.